What if the trait you've always celebrated as your greatest strength, the ability to sense and feel deeply into others, was never really a gift in the first place? What if, instead of being born with supernatural empathy, what you call empathy actually grew out of necessity? Carl Jung once suggested that many highly sensitive people, often praised as empaths, are, in reality, the survivors of childhoods where they were never allowed to put themselves first. These children learned, sometimes silently, sometimes painfully, that their own needs had to be erased so others could remain comfortable. And as they grew, they carried this way of being into adulthood, mistaking hyper-attunement for compassion and self-erasure for love. In this exploration, we'll walk through Jung's profound perspective on empaths, how empathy can begin as a survival strategy, how the shadow hides our birthright to selfhood, why burnout forces a turning point, and how reclaiming what Jung called sacred selfishness opens the door to real wholeness. By the end, you may see empathy in a way you never considered before, not as a burden to carry nor as a badge of honor, but as a calling to rediscover your true self. Before we begin, make sure you subscribe to Deep Psyche and join our community for deeper conversations about Jungian psychology, the inner life, and spiritual growth. Now let's go deeper. Jung was fascinated by how the psyche adapts to hardship. He saw that even in wounded environments, the mind finds creative ways to survive. For children growing up in unstable, chaotic, or emotionally unpredictable households, survival often required vigilance. Imagine a child living with a volatile parent. One wrong word, one small misstep, and the atmosphere in the entire house shifts. That child quickly learns how to scan every facial expression, tone of voice, and silence for meaning. They learn to read the room, not because they want to, but because their safety seems to depend on it. From the outside, this ability looks like empathy, a gift for feeling, sensing, and deeply understanding others. But inside, it's something else entirely. It's the nervous system, finely tuned by stress, operating as an alarm system. It is the survival reflex of a child who is always bracing for what comes next. Modern neuroscience supports this. Chronic stress in early life reshapes the brain. The amygdala, the brain's emotional smoke detector, becomes hypersensitive. The prefrontal cortex, the part that helps regulate emotions and create a stable sense of self, develops under constant pressure to track the moods of others. In practical terms, this child becomes emotionally fluent in others' needs, while remaining almost mute in their own. Jung would have described this as a developmental detour. Instead of forming a stable core identity rooted in their own desires and boundaries, the child's sense of self is sacrificed to the task of keeping others balanced. In adulthood, this person may be admired for their compassion and intuition, but inside they feel like a ghost, always present for others, rarely present for themselves. At the heart of Jung's psychology lies the concept of the shadow, the unacknowledged parts of ourselves we repress or deny. For the empath, what gets buried in the shadow is not cruelty or malice, but something deceptively radical, the right to selfhood. This includes the right to say, I want, the right to say, I need, the right to say no. These simple rights, when denied, become shadow material, the forbidden desires that live on unconsciously and shape every relationship. Jung believed that every child requires a natural stage of self-centeredness, what he sometimes called a healthy narcissism, where their own needs take center stage. This is not indulgence. It's the vital soil from which a strong, authentic ego takes root. The child who has never allowed this stage learns only one lesson. Being selfish is dangerous. What happens then? Natural impulses, anger, frustration, self-protection, self-assertion, are rejected and hidden. What forms in their place is the persona, the mask shown to the world. For the empath, that persona is often the helper, the caretaker, the healer, the ever-available listener. This role earns admiration and approval, yet comes at the price of bearing the true self. Jung warned that when the persona dominates, the individual lives as an actor in someone else's play. They fit the role society gives them, but remain strangers to their own authenticity. The psyche, however, has its own laws. One of Jung's key principles was that of compensation, Whenever one side of the personality is overdeveloped, the other side eventually pushes back. The balance of the self cannot be silenced forever. For empaths, this reckoning often comes as burnout. Burnout is not simply being tired. It is the crash of a psychological survival strategy. After years or decades of carrying the emotional weight of others, the system simply breaks. The empath who once prided themselves on limitless compassion suddenly feels resentment. What used to feel like generosity now feels like heaviness. They find themselves drained, apathetic, and even angry at the very people they once rushed to help. Jung would not have called this weakness. He would have seen it as the psyche's demand for transformation. When a strategy has outlived its usefulness, the unconscious forces us to let it collapse. What looks like breakdown is really the beginning of breakthrough. Research today echoes this. Studies on compassion fatigue among caregivers show that without healthy boundaries, empathy twists into exhaustion and identity loss. Jung saw this as the moment the unconscious insists, "It is time to reclaim your own life." This is where Jung introduced an idea both radical and liberating, what he called sacred selfishness. To Jung, sacred selfishness was not indulgence, cruelty, or disregard for others. Instead, it was the recognition that caring for yourself is indispensable. Without it, there is no true wholeness. To keep denying our own needs is not noble. It is a distortion that leads only to collapse. The paradox is simple. We cannot give authentically unless we allow ourselves to receive. We cannot truly love others while consistently abandoning ourselves. When empaths begin reclaiming sacred selfishness, relationships change. Some bonds dissolve, revealing that they were never genuine. They were built upon silent self-sacrifice. Other relationships deepen because now they are rooted in authenticity and mutuality. For the first time, the empath is relating as a full person, not as a role. Jung contrasted this change in terms of projection versus encounter. Projection is when we reduce others to a role, client, friend in crisis, family member who constantly needs support. Encounter, on the other hand, is when we meet another human being as they truly are. And this shift can only happen once we reclaim ourselves. This transformation allows empaths to shift from compulsive empathy to conscious empathy. Compulsive empathy is reflexive. The empath cannot help but feel, absorb, and react to others' emotions. It is automatic and it drains. Conscious empathy, by contrast, is chosen. The empath decides when to open, when to stay closed, and how much of themselves to offer. This difference is the birth of sovereignty. Jung would say that wholeness requires balancing both sensitivity and strength, compassion and boundary, openness and self-protection. When empaths reclaim sovereignty, their empathy ceases to be a survival reflex. It becomes an intentional, sacred gift, something they offer freely, without compulsion or resentment. At the end of this journey stands what Jung described as the integrated personality. This is the empath who no longer lives as a function for others, but as a whole human being. They embody both their sensitivity and their power, both their tenderness and their selfhood. They no longer confuse hypervigilance with love. They know that saying no can be an act of compassion, just as much as saying yes. They know that sometimes the greatest act of empathy is not overgiving to others, but honoring their own truth first. This is what Jung saw as the privilege of a lifetime, to become who you truly are. For the empath, this means turning the survival strategy of their childhood into a conscious strength in adulthood. It means finally reclaiming the word that was once forbidden, selfish, and realizing that what was once vilified is actually the missing half of compassion. So let me ask you, have you felt this shift in your own life? From compulsive empathy to conscious, sovereign empathy? Have you reached the point where burnout forced you to face yourself? Where you began to reclaim what was once exiled into shadow? If this exploration resonated with you, share your reflections in the comments. Let's walk together on this path of turning survival into strength and vigilance into wisdom. And if you'd like more journeys into Jung's psychology in the depths of the human soul, don't forget to subscribe to Deep Psyche. Together, we'll keep exploring how wounds can become wisdom, how the shadow hides treasure, and how the most difficult stories of the self can lead us into our greatest wholeness.